The woman materialized in the far corner of my cramped studio apartment, her skeletal frame draped in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. She stood impossibly tall. I estimated close to 8 feet despite the way her spine curved forward in an unnatural arch, suggesting her true height was even more grotesque. Her arms hung at her sides like twisted tree branches, so long they nearly reached her knees, and from each fingertip extended what looked like blackened claws that curved inward like a bird of prey. What disturbed me most wasn't her towering presence or even those terrible claws. It was her face. Gaunt beyond human possibility, her cheekbones jutted out sharp enough to cut glass, and her skin was pulled so tight across her skull that I could see the outline of every bone underneath. Her eyes were two black voids that somehow still managed to track my every movement with predatory precision. But worse than her appearance was the sound she made. A constant, low humming that vibrated through the floorboards and into my bones. It wasn't quite singing, wasn't quite moaning, but something in between that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. I pressed myself against the headboard of my unmade bed, my heart hammering so hard I was sure she could hear it. The sheets were damp with cold sweat as I calculated the distance to my bedroom door. 20 feet. Maybe 25 if I factored in having to navigate around my cluttered coffee table and the pile of dirty laundry I'd been meaning to wash for 2 weeks. Could I make it before those impossibly long arms reached me? Would screaming do any good at 2 a.m. in this building where half the apartments were vacant and the other half were occupied by people who'd learned to mind their own business? We stared at each other in the dim light filtering through my grimy curtains. Neither of us moved, neither dared to breathe. It felt like a deadly game of chess where the first move would determine everything that followed. There was an unspoken understanding that this moment balanced on the edge of something terrible, and whoever broke the silence first would tip us all into chaos. My life had been systematically falling apart for the better part of 8 months. At 28, I was exactly where I'd feared I'd be when I graduated college 6 years ago, working a soul-crushing data entry job that barely paid enough to cover rent on this shoebox apartment, living paycheck to paycheck, watching my college friends get married and buy houses and post pictures of their perfect lives on social media, while I couldn't even afford to fix my car's broken air conditioning in the middle of a brutal summer. The loneliness was the worst part, not just the absence of people in my daily life, but the crushing weight of feeling completely invisible in a world that seemed to have no place for me. My relationship with Sarah had ended 3 months ago when she sat me down in that coffee shop on 5th Street and told me, with tears in her eyes, that she needed someone with direction, someone who knows where they're going in life. The worst part was that I couldn't even argue with her. She was right. I was drifting, had been drifting since graduation, maybe even before that. My father had been diagnosed with something he refused to talk about in detail. Every time I called home, he'd deflect with that fake cheerful voice and say it was manageable, nothing to worry about, son. But I could hear the fear underneath, could see it in the way his shoulders had started to stoop when I visited last month, the way his clothes hung looser on his frame. My mother had died when I was 15, and the thought of losing him too, of being completely alone in the world, sent me into panic attacks that left me gasping for air on my kitchen floor. The financial stress was relentless. Credit card bills stacked on my kitchen counter like a paper mountain of failure. Student loans that seemed to grow larger every month despite my payments. The constant anxiety of checking my bank balance, of calculating whether I could afford groceries, or if I'd have to subsist on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for another week. I'd started picking up odd jobs on weekends, walking dogs, moving furniture, anything to make a few extra dollars, but it never seemed to be enough. Last night, in a moment of desperation I barely remembered through the haze of exhaustion and despair, I'd done something I hadn't done since I was a child sitting in my grandmother's church pew. I'd prayed. Not to any specific god or deity. I'd lost my faith years ago when my mother was dying and all the prayers in the world couldn't save her. But to anyone or anything that might be listening in the vast emptiness of the universe. The woman's head tilted unnaturally to the side, joints creaking like old furniture settling in an empty house. The sound made my skin crawl, reminded me of the way tree branches scraped against windows during winter storms. Then she spoke, her voice like gravel being poured into a metal bucket, each word deliberate and slow. "Marcus," she said, drawing out my name like she was tasting it, rolling it around in her mouth. "You called for me." "I didn't call anyone," I whispered, though even as the words left my mouth, fragments of last night came rushing back. Standing in this same room at 3 in the morning, tears streaming down my face, my voice hoarse from sobbing as I begged anyone listening to send me a sign that my life had meaning, that I wasn't just another failed experiment in human consciousness doomed to live and die without ever mattering to anyone. She stepped forward, and I noticed with growing terror that her feet didn't quite touch the ground. She glided rather than walked, her tattered black dress flowing around her like smoke. "You called for guidance, for purpose." Her mouth barely moved when she spoke, as if the words were being projected from somewhere else entirely, maybe from that constant humming that seemed to emanate from her chest. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but the memory was crystal clear now. I had called out into the darkness, hadn't I? In my moment of complete desperation, I'd thrown my last desperate prayer into the void. "Please, if there's anyone out there, anything out there, I need help. I need to know what I'm supposed to do with my life. I can't keep going like this. Please, just show me the way forward." Before I could respond, she raised one elongated finger, the claw at its tip gleaming in the dim light, and pointed toward my window. "Come," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to something deeper, more primitive. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything but follow this nightmare creature into the darkness. But something in her empty eyes held me captive, something that spoke to the deepest part of my desperation. When she turned and glided toward my front door, somehow compressing her massive frame to fit through the doorway in a way that defied physics, I found myself standing on shaking legs, my body moving without my conscious permission. The hallway of my apartment building had never felt so long or so empty. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach for us as we passed. Mrs. Chen's apartment was silent. Usually I could hear her television through the thin walls, but tonight there was nothing. The building felt abandoned, like we were the only living things in a tomb. The streets of downtown Millbrook were empty at this hour, 2:30 a.m. according to my phone, though the numbers seemed to blur and shift when I tried to focus on them. The few cars that passed seemed to look right through us, as if we weren't there at all, or maybe as if we existed in some parallel version of reality that only occasionally intersected with the normal world. Streetlights created pools of sickly yellow illumination that we moved through like ghosts, and I noticed that the woman cast no shadow despite her solid appearance. We walked for what felt like hours, though my phone insisted only 45 minutes had passed. She led me through neighborhoods I'd never seen despite living in Millbrook for 3 years, past houses that looked abandoned even though lights glowed in some windows, past a park where the playground equipment looked twisted and wrong in the darkness, like the fevered dream of someone who'd never actually seen children play. The silence was oppressive. Not just the absence of our voices, we didn't speak during the entire journey, but the absence of all the small sounds that usually filled the night. No insects chirping, no distant traffic, no air conditioning units humming from apartment buildings. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Finally, we reached the old Riverside Bridge, a crumbling concrete structure that spanned the Millbrook River about 2 miles from downtown. During the day, it was just another piece of deteriorating infrastructure that the city council kept promising to repair. At night, in the company of this creature, it felt like a gateway to somewhere else entirely. The woman stopped at the center of the bridge and pointed down at the murky water below with one of those terrible claws. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the rusted railing, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the metal to steady myself. The river was dark, almost black, and for a moment I couldn't see anything but my own reflection distorted by the gentle current. Then I saw it. There, floating face up in the dark water about 20 feet from the bridge, was a body. Even from this distance, even in the poor light provided by a single flickering street lamp, I could see it was wearing my clothes. My favorite blue jacket with the small tear in the left elbow where I'd caught it on a fence last winter. My jeans, the ones with the paint stain on the right knee from when I'd helped my neighbor touch up his porch. My shoes. The beat-up sneakers I'd worn to work every day for the past 2 years, because I couldn't afford to replace them. "That's not me," I said, backing away from the edge, my voice cracking with panic. "That can't be me. I'm right here. I'm standing right here." The woman's laugh was like glass breaking in reverse, like the sound of something beautiful being destroyed but played backward. She turned to face me fully for the first time, and I saw that her mouth was too wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, filled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. She reached out with those terrible arms and grabbed me by the throat, her claws digging into my skin just enough to draw blood. She lifted me effortlessly over the railing, holding me suspended above the dark water. Her grip was like ice, so cold it burned, so cold that I could feel my skin beginning to freeze where she touched me. "Your path," she hissed, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling like rotting flowers and old earth. "Your future. This is what awaits when you choose despair over action." Suddenly, the world below erupted in flames. The river boiled and turned black as tar, releasing clouds of sulfurous steam that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. The smell was indescribable, like every terrible thing that had ever rotted, mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of burning plastic. I could hear screaming, thousands of voices crying out in agony, their cries echoing off the water and the bridge supports until it became a symphony of suffering that threatened to drive me insane. The heat was unbearable, even suspended 20 feet above the surface. Sweat poured down my face despite the woman's freezing grip on my throat. I watched in horror as the body below my body began to move, turning over in the boiling water and reaching up toward me with fingers that were burned down to the bone. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and I could see that its eyes had been replaced by glowing coals. "I don't want this," I screamed, my voice barely audible over the chorus of the damned below. "I just want to matter. I want my life to mean something. I don't want to die like this." The woman's grip loosened slightly, and for a moment, her terrifying features softened. The flames below flickered and dimmed, and the screaming faded to a whisper. "Then you understand," she said in a voice completely different from before, warm, almost maternal, like my mother's voice when she used to comfort me after nightmares. "You understand what it means to truly want to live." The hellish vision disappeared completely. The water returned to its normal dark blue, reflecting the stars that had somehow appeared in the clear night sky. She set me down gently on the bridge, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping and shaking, my throat burning where her claws had touched me. "Life is suffering, Marcus," she said, kneeling beside me with impossible grace. Her appearance had changed again. She was still tall and thin, but no longer skeletal. Her claws had become normal fingers, and her face, while still gaunt, was almost beautiful in an otherworldly way. But it is also infinite possibility. Every day you wake up is another chance to build something meaningful, to connect with another soul, to leave a mark on this world that says, "I was here, and I mattered." She placed her hand, now warm instead of freezing, on my forehead, and suddenly I could see everything with perfect clarity. Not visions of some distant future, but the truth about my present circumstances. I saw my father's fear, hidden behind his brave face and cheerful deflections. He was terrified of leaving me alone in the world, just as terrified as I was of losing him. I saw Sarah, not as someone who had rejected me for my failures, but as someone who had been struggling with her own fears about commitment, who had ended our relationship not because she didn't love me, but because she was afraid of loving someone who seemed determined to disappear into his own despair. I saw my coworkers, really saw them for the first time. Jennifer, the older woman who sat 2 desks away, who I'd always thought was cold and unfriendly, but who I now realized was struggling to care for her elderly mother with dementia while working full-time. David, the guy who always seemed so confident and put together, but who went home every night to an empty apartment and wondered if he'd ever find someone who could love him for who he really was, not just the successful facade he presented to the world. I saw my neighbors, Mrs. Chen, who wasn't antisocial but lonely, who kept her television loud because the sound of voices made her feel less alone in her 1-bedroom apartment. The young couple downstairs who fought constantly, not because they didn't love each other, but because they were both working two jobs and were too exhausted and stressed to communicate properly. All of these people carrying their own burdens, fighting their own battles, just as isolated and desperate as I was. All of us walking around thinking we were the only ones struggling, the only ones who felt lost and afraid and uncertain about the future. Purpose isn't something that's given to you, Marcus. The woman continued, her voice gentle but firm. It's something you choose every single day, in every small act of kindness, every moment of genuine connection, every time you choose to keep going despite the pain. You've been waiting for someone to tell you what your life is supposed to mean, but meaning is something you create, not something you discover. When she removed her hand from my forehead, I felt different, not cured. I knew the depression would still be there tomorrow, knew the anxiety and the financial stress and the loneliness wouldn't magically disappear. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not the desperate, grasping hope of someone drowning, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who has seen the bottom and knows that the only direction left is up. The woman stood and began to fade, becoming translucent in the growing light of dawn. Remember, she said as her form became more and more transparent, you are never truly alone. Others see you even when you can't see them seeing you. Your pain matters because you matter. Your struggles have meaning because they connect you to every other person who has ever felt lost and afraid. I walked home as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, my mind clearer than it had been in months. The streets looked different somehow, not because they had changed, but because I was seeing them with new eyes. I noticed things I'd been too wrapped up in my own misery to see before. A small garden someone had planted in front of their apartment building, a mural painted on the side of a convenience store, a cat sleeping peacefully in a sunny window. The next day, I called my father. Really called him, not just the perfunctory check-ins we'd been doing. I told him I loved him and that whatever he was facing, he didn't have to face it alone. I told him I was scared too. Scared of losing him. Scared of being alone in the world. For the first time in months, we had a real conversation. He told me about his diagnosis, prostate cancer, caught early, treatable but scary. We cried together over the phone, and somehow, sharing the fear made it more manageable. I didn't try to get Sarah back. I realized that chapter was closed, and for good reason. We had both been in different places, wanting different things, and our breakup had been necessary for both of us to grow. But I did reach out to some old friends I'd lost touch with, people I'd stopped calling because I was embarrassed about my circumstances. Most of them were struggling too, in their own ways, and we found comfort in reconnecting over our shared imperfections. I started saying hello to my neighbors, really saying hello, not just the polite nod I'd been giving them for 3 years. I learned that Mrs. Chun had been a teacher for 40 years before retiring, that she had incredible stories about her students and her immigration to America. I offered to help the young couple downstairs when I heard them struggling to carry groceries up the stairs, and learned that they were both working multiple jobs to pay for her nursing school. I began volunteering at the local food bank on weekends. At first, it was just something to fill the empty hours, but I quickly discovered that helping others was the fastest way to get outside of my own head. The other volunteers became friends, and the people we served reminded me that everyone was fighting battles I knew nothing about. The depression didn't magically disappear. There were still days when getting out of bed felt impossible, when the weight of existence seemed too heavy to bear. But I had learned something that night on the bridge. The cure for despair isn't happiness. It's purpose. And purpose, I discovered, was everywhere if you knew how to look for it. It was in the small conversations with coworkers, in the phone calls with my father, in the hours spent sorting donations at the food bank, in the simple act of choosing to keep going even when everything felt hopeless. Sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed waiting for sleep, I still feel like I'm being watched. But it doesn't frighten me anymore. If she's still out there, if she's still appearing to people who have lost their way in the darkness of their own despair, then maybe that's her purpose too. Maybe she's not an angel or a demon, but something in between. A guardian of those who have forgotten how to guard themselves. And maybe, in the end, that's what salvation really is. Not being saved from suffering, but being shown that suffering can have meaning if we choose to let it guide us toward connection rather than isolation, toward purpose rather than emptiness, toward hope rather than despair. I keep my curtains open now, Whatever's watching from the darkness, I'm not afraid to be seen. I matter. My pain matters. My struggles have meaning. And tomorrow I'll choose to keep going, one day at a time, one small act of purpose at a time.